The time had come. Men and women on both sides of the Atlantic knew that the horrible, degrading, and hateful business of slavery had to come to an end. The abolition movement grew daily in strength of numbers. They had all set for themselves the task of ridding the world of this crime against humanity. But how would they focus their energies? Who would carry their cause to the seat of government? One man came to see this work as his destiny. That man was William Wilberforce. This is his story. This is his legacy.
If you take the word slavery away from this whole story, what was it really about? It was about the wicked traffic in human beings. It was about the destruction of a civilization and culture in Africa and in the Caribbean. It was about lust. It was about greed, the huge greed that people had, not just white people, but also some Africans who were selling their own people for money.
There's a huge amount of money to be made from the slave trade. But the question then arises, how can you justify making money at such a kind of human cost? How can you justify the fact that the British want their sugar grown by slaves to sweeten their tea? How can you justify that in terms of the violence that's done to Africans? And not just to a few Africans. We're talking about the largest movement of people, enforced movement of people until the Second World War. This is a huge, huge operation. And it becomes clear that it's based on violence and brutality of an extraordinary scale.
On Sunday, October 27, 1787, Wilberforce finally made up his mind. After church services and another long conversation with Newton, he wrote the 4 simple lines that have become one of the greatest personal mission statements of all time.
God Almighty has placed before me 2 great objects, the suppression of the slave trade and the reformation of manners.
Those 2 objectives were to drive William Wilberforce, guiding him, fueling him, and focusing all his energies for the rest of his days.
It's recorded for us. The guy was given to kind of bouts of depression, and he got down about life, he got despondent and despairing. Did Wilberforce know at the beginning of his campaign for the abolition of the slave trade, and that it would take him 20 years? And I'm sure if he thought about that, he'd think, I have no influence.
And he suffers what appears to have been his second nervous breakdown. Mentally, he was distraught. Physically, his health broke. He was devastated. Images of slaves in chains, in bondage, the horrors of the Middle Passage ran through his mind. He couldn't sleep.
But in reality, he probably was ahead of his time, because I think the environmentalists, certainly the abolitionists, those who voice various kinds of needs for freedom in certain areas, women, in almost every category, he probably represents the model for all of it. Though he has not been ascribed such, we can still look at William Wilberforce not just as a symbol, but as a human being who made a contribution, because we know where his heart was.
Wilberforce went to the House of Commons, and as debate began on the bill abolishing the slave trade, members would jump to their feet in bunches, in groups. They all wanted to speak on this great issue. It became apparent very early on that something very different was going to take place.
And at that moment, the House thought that was a wonderful point, and they started to cheer. And Wilberforce, overcome with emotion, sat there with his head bowed and tears streaming down his face as he thought that this act at long last was going to become law.
British historian Trevelyan describes the moment a year after the vote, and he describes this image of the West Indian Negroes on a hill waiting for the sunrise, knowing that the moment the sun rose, the moment that day dawned, they would be free. It's just an extraordinary image and shows us that real human beings were involved in this. Human beings who hoped for freedom, who awaited the sunrise to celebrate something that they thought could never possibly happen in their lifetimes.
Although it was something without precedent, it became something that ennobled the British nation, called them, to use Lincoln's phrase, to remember the better angels of their nature. Wilberforce's power, the power of his personality, the power of his principles, helped change British life, and one cannot lay enough stress upon that.